Your lungs burn as if you have inhaled ground glass mixed with pepper. But there is no fire, just the air saturated with a typical Tuesday in Chatham. The shed is a dark and endless brick throat, stretching nearly 400 meters, where the sunlight can barely penetrate the thick fog of golden particles floating in the stagnant environment. Men with their faces wrapped in filthy rags cough violently, expelling a dark and fibrous phlegm, the inevitable result of processing tons of raw hemp imported from the Baltic that arrives covered in dirt, dead insects, and rotten moisture. The smell is a nauseating mixture of decomposing plant matter and the sour sweat of hundreds of workers who know that this dust not only irritates, it slowly kills, petrifying lung tissue long before modern medicine gives a name to this disease. The process begins with a necessary violence against the plant itself, where coarse bundles of stiff fibers must be beat into submission to become usable threads in the Navy. Rows of men, known as rakers, stand before long boards riddled with sharp steel points, violently striking the bundles of hemp against the metal teeth and pulling with full force to comb the tangled fibers. The sound is rhythmic and brutal, a constant hissing of tearing that sends clouds of microscopic dust straight into the operator's airways, covering their eyebrows and clothes with a thin layer of toxic snow. There are no protective masks or forced ventilation, just the Admiralty's demand that each fiber be perfectly aligned and free of coarse debris. This initial torture of the raw material is the invisible foundation of British naval supremacy, for any imperfection left here, any knot or weakness in the fiber, will propagate exponentially when these fibers are twisted into thick ropes. If a raker fails due to exhaustion or negligence, the anchor cable of a first-rate ship can snap during a storm in the North Atlantic 3 years later, condemning 800 sailors to death. The responsibility weighs as heavily as the dense air of the shed. But the real logistical nightmare begins when this combed fiber needs to be turned into yarn, requiring such an exhaustive human choreography that it will deform the anatomy of those who execute it. The official history often cleans the blood and dust from these pages, preferring the glory of admirals to the agony of laborers. If you have the stomach to keep facing the raw and forgotten truth of the past, secure your enrollment now. Here, we never look away. Imagine walking backward for 32 kilometers every day, 6 days a week, while carrying 30 kilos of fiber rolled around your waist and manipulating delicate threads with the tips of sensitive fingers. This is the reality for spinners in the Royal Ropeworks, men trapped in a wheel that never stops turning, powered by large cranks operated by children or apprentices at the ends of the building. The spinner attaches a tuft of hemp to the spinning hook and begins his backward march into the darkness of the shed, feeding the fiber into the hook as he retreats step by step, relying solely on muscle memory not to trip and fall on the dirt floor covered in debris. The precision required here is superhuman, as the yarn needs to have an exact and constant thickness along 300 meters in length without the aid of any caliper or digital sensor. If the spinner walks too fast, the yarn becomes thin and brittle. If he walks too slowly, the yarn becomes thick and wastes precious material, a capital sin in the eyes of the foremen who monitor the process with measuring sticks. The repetitive motion of pulling the fiber from the waist with the right hand and smoothing the yarn with the left, while the legs push the body backward, creates a grotesque muscular asymmetry over the years, leaving these men with crooked shoulders and a peculiar gait that instantly identifies them in the local taverns as ropeworks workers. The sheet was built so long precisely to allow an entire yarn to be spun in one piece without joints, because joints are breaking points waiting to happen under the tension of tons of wind. It is a linear production line where the machine is the building itself and the engine is human suffering converted into torque. When the spinner finally reaches the end of the line, exhausted and covered in dust, his work is far from over, for that raw, pale, and vulnerable yarn would not survive a week in the corrosive salt water of the ocean without going through the most dangerous and hellish process of the entire operation. Before the threads can be joined to form ropes, they need to be immortalized in a boiling bath of Stockholm tar, a black, viscous, and highly flammable substance derived from charred pines. The smell in the tar house, a separate annex of the main building due to fears of catastrophic fires, is strong enough to make eyes water 200 meters away. Inside, gigantic copper cauldrons keep the liquid bubbling at temperatures that would melt human skin upon immediate contact, fueled by underground furnaces that turn the environment into a toxic sauna where the risk of a steam explosion or chemical fire is omnipresent. The white hemp threads are slowly dragged through this boiling tar, submerging in the liquid darkness so that each microscopic fiber becomes impregnated with the protective resin that will repel seawater and prevent rotting. Men with long iron hooks and thick leather gloves, which soon become saturated and useless, guide the material through squeezing rollers designed to remove excess tar, returning the precious liquid to the cauldron. It is a dirty job on a level that defies modern understanding. The tar enters the pores, permanently staining the skin and lungs, and splash burns are treated right there with dirty rags and grease, often leading to infections that cost entire limbs. The tension here is palpable because the temperature of the tar needs to be controlled with absolute precision without thermometers. Too cold and it doesn't penetrate the center of the thread, leaving the rope to rot from the inside out months later. Too hot and it burns the hemp fibers, making the line brittle and useless even before it leaves the shipyard. The tar masters observe the viscosity and bubbles with eagle eyes, knowing that the safety of a 100-gun warship depends on their ability to judge the boiling point of this black sludge. But even with the threads protected and cured, they are still just loose threads, and turning them into a line capable of holding 5 tons of anchor will require a battle against physics that is about to begin. Transforming loose threads into a cohesive rope is not just a matter of twisting. It is an act of controlled violence against physics where the accumulated potential energy can kill a man in the blink of an eye. The formation process involves stretching hundreds of tarred threads along the entire length of the 300-meter track and twisting them together under excruciating tension until they beg to bend. The danger lies in the fact that, while one end is being twisted by a massive wheel, the rope naturally wants to untwist with a rotational force capable of breaking arms like twigs. To control this fury, the rope makers use a solid wood conical tool called a top, which is inserted between the threads being closed, forcing them to lie evenly over one another. The man in charge of the top has the most terrifying job in the shipyard, as he must walk toward the wheel that is twisting, holding the wooden cone at the exact point where the tension is critical. If he advances too quickly, the rope becomes loose and useless. If he goes too slowly or stumbles, the accumulated twist behind him can make the rope whip violently. The sound inside the shed changes during this stage, shifting from the buzzing of the spinning wheels to a deep and sinister groan of the fibers being compressed against one another, a creaking of wood and hemp that sounds like the mast of a ship about to sail during a hurricane. Accidents here are visceral and immediate, as when a thread under high tension snaps, it not only falls to the ground, it ricochets with the speed of a musket ball. Stories of men who lost ears, noses, or had the flesh of their faces torn by a line that snapped circulate like horror legends among the apprentices, keeping everyone in a state of paranoid alertness. The tension is so great that the wood of the top often begins to smoke due to friction against the rough hemp, requiring assistants to throw lard or water to prevent the tool itself from catching fire in the middle of the line, adding steam and the smell of burnt fat to the already unbreathable air. When the time comes to manufacture the main anchor cable of a first-rate ship, the scale of the work ceases to be human and becomes monstrous, demanding the brute strength of hundreds of men operating in unison. We are talking about a cable with more than 60 centimeters in circumference, a heavy black serpent that, once finished, will weigh tons and be hard as an oak log. To twist something of this magnitude, simple manual wheels are not enough. Gigantic twisting rigs are necessary, powered by teams of 12 or 16 men pushing winch bars until their muscles burn and their feet slip on the oily ground. The manufacture of this Leviathan is an event that paralyzes other operations, as the necessary space is total, and the pace is dictated by collective exhaustion. 3 thick ropes, which have been formed earlier, are now twisted together in the opposite direction to their original twist, a vital mechanical principle to prevent the cable from unraveling on its own. The internal friction generated during the closing of a cable of this diameter is so intense that the core of the rope can reach dangerous temperatures, cooking the tar inside and, in rare and catastrophic cases, causing spontaneous combustion days after the cable has been coiled in the ship's hold, starting mysterious fires at sea. Watching the closing of the anchor cable is to witness a primitive struggle between the will of the Admiralty and the resistance of the material. The men on the winches shout and sing to keep the rhythm, sweating profusely in the damp cold, while the master rope maker obsessively watches the geometry of the spiral. There is no room for error here, as a faulty anchor cable means the loss of a million-pound ship on the rocks of an enemy coast. When the work finally ends, the hemp monster lies on the floor of the shed, warm to the touch, exhaling chemical vapors, a vital artery of naval warfare forged purely with sweat and applied geometry. What makes all this suffering necessary is a cruel equation that no machine of the time could solve, the relationship between length and strength known as shortening. For a rope, too, have the necessary elasticity to absorb the impact of a giant wave. Without breaking, it needs to lose about 1/3 of its original length during twisting. This means that to produce a 200-meter cable, men need to start with 300 meters of thread, sacrificing 100 meters of expensive material and hours of labor just to create the helical spring that will save the ship. This math was not done on paper with calculators, but rather in the eye and the sensitivity of the fingers of the master craftsman who understood that a too hard rope would break under shock, while a too soft rope would stretch until it deformed and allowed water to penetrate and rot the core. It was a precarious balance that depended entirely on the human touch to feel the tension in the fibers in real time and adjust the speed of the twisting instantly. Something that the early steam machines, with their brute and stupid force, were incapable of replicating without destroying the product. The tragic irony of this era is that naval technology was advancing rapidly in hull design and cannons, but the most vital component that held everything together still relied on medieval methods and physical suffering. Every inch of shortening in the cable represented stored energy, a mechanical battery charged by the bodies of the laborers in Chatham, ready to be unleashed when HMS Victory or HMS Royal George faced the fury of the Atlantic. The strength of the British Empire was not only in the oak of its ships, but in the spiral geometry empirically calculated by illiterate men who sacrificed their backs to ensure that the mathematics of survival worked. Moving the finished cable out of the shed is not a common delivery task. It is an improvised civil engineering operation in the mud and ice. The anchor cable, now an inert and rigid mass weighing more than 4 tons, needs to be coiled while it still retains some heat from friction, because if it cools completely, stretched out, it becomes hard as iron and impossible to handle. Dozens of longshoremen struggle against the stiffness of the tarred hemp, using wooden levers and brute strength to force the monster to bend into compact coils. A job where crushed feet and fingers are so frequent that they barely register as incidents worthy of pause. The smell of cold sweat and despair hangs in the air as they wrestle with the physics of the object, knowing that if the coil tumbles or unwinds violently, it will crush anyone in its path against the brick walls. Once coiled, the transport to the dock is a logistical nightmare in itself, carried out without hydraulic cranes or forklifts, relying purely on reinforced carts pulled by pairs of 12 or more heavy draft horses. The wheels of the carts often sink up to the axle in the semi-frozen mud of the Chatham yard, requiring men and beasts to push and pull in a Sisyphean effort under the freezing rain. The sound is a cacophony of cracking whips, wood groaning under the absurd weight, and shouted commands to prevent the precious cargo from sliding and tumbling in the dirt, which would ruin months of work and cost the jobs of everyone involved. Watching this black snake being dragged through the narrow streets of the shipyard towards the hull of the ship is like watching the vital artery of the Navy being transplanted. It is a moment of extreme vulnerability, where the most important weapon against the storms is exposed, useless and heavy, a dead weight that demands absolute respect. Every meter traveled is a victory against gravity and friction, and when it finally arrives at the side of the ship, the task of hoisting this compact mass into the hold through the tight hatches is a three-dimensional puzzle that often takes days to complete, blocking access and consuming the resources of the entire lower deck. If the shed was a stifling hell, the rigging of the ship in winter is a freezing purgatory where a misstep means a fall of 30 meters to certain death on the hard wooden deck. The riggers, men specialized in rigging the ropes, climb the bare masts facing slicing winds that turn the residual tar from the ropes into a slippery, glassy surface. Their hands, calloused and cracked from the cold, need to handle thick and rigid cables, passing them through sheaves and pulleys while precariously balancing on frost-covered yards with no safety nets or modern harnesses. Installing the standing rigging, the stays and shrouds that hold the masts in place, requires brutal tension to ensure that the structure withstands the tons of pressure from the wind on the sails. Using tackles and blocks, teams on deck pull with all their strength, while the men above hammer the rigging to set it in place, shouting instructions that are carried away by the howling wind. The sound of the new hemp stretching is a dry and terrifying crack, like bones breaking, signaling that the fiber is settling and biting into the wood. If a yard cable breaks now under this maximum tension, it will whip with enough force to decapitate a man or cut the mast in half. The cold seeps into the joints and makes movements slow and clumsy, but precision must be surgical. A poorly made knot or a loose splice up here cannot be corrected during a battle or storm. It is a delayed death sentence that will only be executed when the ship is most vulnerable. The blood from the skinned fingertips often stains the virgin hemp, a literal sacrifice absorbed by the rope, sealing a silent pact between the sailor and the material that, hopefully, will keep him alive when the ocean tries to swallow the entire ship months later. The true cost of British naval supremacy is not found in the Treasury's accounting books, but etched in the distorted anatomy of men who leave the gates of Chatham at the end of a lifetime of work. The veteran rope makers are easy to identify in the crowd. They walk with a permanent forward lean and one shoulder higher than the other, the skeletal result of decades of walking backward and pulling fibers with one side of their body. Their spines are maps of work-induced scoliosis, twisted and calcified into unnatural positions that guarantee chronic pain with every breath until the day of their death. But the most insidious damage is invisible, hidden deep within the pink tissue of the lungs now stained black and brown. The whipping cough is a common sentence, a primitive form of bisonosis caused by the constant inhalation of hemp dust and tar fumes. Men in their 40s breathe with the difficulty of men in their 80s, their chests wheezing like punctured bellows, expelling dark phlegm that signals the end of their productive usefulness. There is no disability compensation, nor medical leave. When the body fails and the man can no longer keep pace with the wheel or carry the weight of the rope, he is simply discarded, replaced by a younger, intact apprentice ready to be ground by the same machine. In addition to the chronic illnesses, there is the army of mutilated men begging at the doors of the port taverns, men without fingers, lost to pulleys, men with extensive chemical burn scars stretching the skin of their faces, men who limp due to bones crushed by cable coils. They are the industrial rejects of a system that values a yard of rope more than human life. The Royal Fleet sails on oceans of salt water, but metaphorically floats on a sea of broken bodies, a foundation of ground flesh and bone to ensure that Britain continues to rule the waves. When we look at the romantic paintings of 18th century line ships, with their inflated white sails and majestic hulls cutting through the waves, we see only the superficial glory of imperial conquest. What our modern eyes fail to perceive is that this wooden giant is not a solid structure, but a precarious assembly of moving parts held together almost exclusively by the manufactured agony in the dark ropeworks of Chatham. Without the miles of twisted hemp soaked in tar and sweat, the masts would collapse at the first gust of strong wind, the cannons would break free, crushing their own crews, and the anchors would be useless dead weights at the bottom of the sea. Rope was not just an accessory. It was the central nervous system of the Navy, transmitting the force of the wind to the hull and allowing the captain's will to become actual movement. The final irony of this pre-industrial era lies in the total dependence on human fragility to create mechanical resilience. While admirals schemed global strategies on velvet maps and politicians in London debated the fate of nations, the viability of their plans rested entirely on the petrified lungs of the ropemakers and the deformed backs of the cordwainers. No steam engine, no precision gear or scientific innovation of the time could replicate the tactile sensitivity needed to judge the tension of a thread or the curing of tar. The British Empire, in all its pomp and firepower, was literally hanging by a thread spun by men who walked backward into darkness so that the nation could sail toward the light of the future. Today, the great brick buildings of the ropeworks stand as silent cathedrals of a brutal and forgotten religion. The ships they equipped have long rotted or been dismantled, and the ropes that held the fate of the free world have turned to dust and memory. But if you walk along the packed earth floors of Chatham on a damp winter's day, you can still sense the phantom smell of tar and hear the distant echo of thousands of dragged footsteps. Economic history is not made of gold and treaties alone. It is forged in the flesh of those who transformed raw material into power, paying the price with their own vitality so that the machine of civilization could continue to turn, indifferent and insatiable. History is forged in flesh, and the machine of civilization is insatiable. If you have the stomach to continue witnessing the true cost of progress, sign up now. And answer in the comments, would your lungs have endured a single shift in this hell, or would you have broken in the first hour?